Well, good morning, everyone. Perhaps we'll get started. It reminds me a little bit of going to church as a kid. The first couple of pews are always empty and everybody sits there. Or maybe that was math class. It's kind of confusing. My name's Tim Simboli. I'm the one of the two co-chairs of the CFICE committee. Catherine Graham is the other co-chair from the faculty here. You probably are all quite familiar with Catherine. Catherine's not feeling well this morning, so what is usually a duet is going to turn into a solo act, so please bear with me. I'll have to say her lines as well, and I'm thinking I might try to imitate her voice. No, I'm not going to do that. In my day job, I'm the executive director of CMHA Ottawa. CMHA Ottawa is a community-based agency here in town that has worked in the field of mental health promotion, education, policy, but we also deal with people who have serious mental illnesses. So for the most part, our clientele are people who are extremely vulnerable. Besides having a serious diagnosed mental illness, virtually every one of them is housing challenged, so many of them are street people. They all have complications of one sort or another. They're either addicted or developmentally delayed, or on and on and on. These are folks who really struggle, and they struggle on a day-to-day basis with some of the things that we take for granted. In fact, shelter and food is one of the things that they worry about constantly. So I'm delighted that this morning's topic focuses on one of the four aspects of the CFICE project, which is food security, because the folks I deal with have a lot of food insecurity. With that in mind, let's get started. This is actually the first public event for CFICE, which stands for Community First, Impacts of Community Engagement. And it really is about how community agencies, community writ large, and the university can work together. And the project is designed to try and discover how we can do that better. And what we've done is we've taken four themes to explore that. Poverty reduction, community environmental sustainability, reducing violence against women, and this morning's topic, which is community food security. One of the things that makes CFICE unique is that it really, built into the DNA of the project, has been this marriage between the community and the university. And I know from years and years, decades actually, of dealing with many of the faculty here at the university that the increasing the ties between the university and the community is something that's near and dear to the hearts of Carleton and many academics across the country. And it certainly is something that those of us in the community side see as a valuable development. So this is a very long-term project that's going to explore how we do this and how we can do it better. So trying to take maybe some of the haphazardness that has occurred and really kind of focus that. This morning we have an absolutely terrific panel. I think you'll find it very informative. I'm not going to talk anymore. In fact, I'm going to turn things over. One note here is that we are both videotaping and live streaming this. I'm not sure what live streaming is, but it sounds very intimidating. If you are going to speak, when we have questions, please use the mics at the front of the room, and then we can capture you for posterity. And anyways, that's what we will be doing. So I'm going to turn things over now to Stephen Huddart. Stephen is on my left here, is the president of McConnell Foundation. And I've been told, Stephen, that you actually have some roots and interests in the food security business that go beyond your role as the leader of McConnell. And I'm going to invite you to fill us in on what that is. I'm interested in myself. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Stephen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome everyone to the first Community First Impacts of Community Engagement panel, putting our money where our mouths are, the federal budget and food insecurity. I'd like to just take a couple of moments to talk about the role of the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation in this issue and touch on my own experiences a little bit before we get underway. So this is the 76th year that the McConnell Family Foundation has been operating in Canada, and it was founded as a result of the failure of a family farm. J.W. and his brothers and sisters and parents were land grant recipients and were farming in the Muskoka region north of Toronto and couldn't make it. Like many people, they had to give up, move south. The family moved into 2 rooms above a general store. The kids went out every day and found what work they could and came back and shared what they had gathered or earned. And that was the beginning of J.W.'s, that's why he left school after at a very young age. But it also led him to work in a trading company and learned about commodities trading, how you did import, export, and so on. And the long story that I won't go into has him at one point owning Ogilvy Mills, St. Lawrence Sugar, very significant food enterprises in this country, as well as many others. But at the depths of the Depression, at the height of the Depression in 1935, he established a philanthropic foundation to address the community need that he saw so blatantly, so evidently around him in Montreal. My own background in the food field is one of being an entrepreneur, a social entrepreneur. I had an early actually introduction to food issues living in Latin America and could see the tremendous disparities between an economy, on the one hand, that was dedicated to raising cattle for export, while it displaced Aboriginal communities and in fact subjected them to out-and-out starvation. And so I made a film about that made its way around the world, and as a journalist was quite interested in those kinds of issues. Later I worked in the natural food business. When I came back to Canada, I found I had to learn how to eat. I was used to living on a pretty straight ahead, corn, beans, and occasional protein type diet in Latin America, and was overwhelmed with the wealth and choice and content of so much food that was available here. It was really shocking to me. I had a hard time adjusting. I went to work in the natural food business and learned about diet in a North American context, and eventually started a restaurant with a couple of friends. We had a social enterprise in Vancouver. It was a jazz cafe, community hub, incubator of other social enterprises, and had a wonderful time doing that. Food, as I experienced it, was a great connector and community builder, and something that I think that you know and that our panelists are well aware of. Which really brings us to the theme of today's panel. And in preparing for it, I was reading a very compelling report issued by the European Environment Agency just last month, which highlights that as an innovation system, our top-down, technology-driven, patent-producing, genetic GMO-type structures are actually designed to produce massive failure of our food systems. That unless we integrate the knowledge and provide policy and agroecological scientific support to the bottom of the pyramid, to vulnerable communities, to our entire food system, we just aren't going to make it. The concern is that in Canada today, we are overemphasizing at the policy level those top-down technological fixes and under-investing in our capacity to create resilient, inclusive, and sustainable food economies. So that's the challenge, and today's panel presents 4 people who will contend that the federal government is not in touch with the question of food security in this country. How is it that at a time when we're one of the world's wealthiest nations and a major food export, that during any given year, 12% of our population is at one time food insecure? Why is obesity increasing at a rate faster than it is in the United States? Why is it that among OECD countries we stand out as not even having a national food policy? Our speakers are here today to make the case that we can and must do better, and that the federal budget should be used to establish policies, fiscal measures, and programs that address food security for all Canadians. Our speakers are, in order, Peter Andree, Associate Professor of Political Science at Carleton University; Terry Audla, President of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami; Cathleen Kneen, Editor of the Ram's Horn and Chair of Just Food; and at the far end, Diana Bronson, Executive Director of Food Secure Canada. So each speaker will have 10 minutes to address the question of what's happening, what's not happening, and what needs to be done. And we'll have a couple of minutes after each speaker to take questions, follow-up questions, a little bit of discussion, and try and reserve a good half an hour and 40 minutes at the end for an open discussion. So, turning to our first speaker, Peter Andree is an associate professor, as I mentioned, of political science at Carleton. His teaching and research focus include the political economy and the political ecology of the agricultural and food systems. And he's going to speak this morning about the voices that are heard and not heard in food and agricultural policy discussions in Canada. Please welcome Peter Andree.
Would you all like to go up there or stay seated? Sorry, Derek. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for having me here and for launching the CFICE project with a focus on food security. I think this is, as you'll learn through the conversations today and some of the questions, the CFICE project is a research project about learning how to work well between academics and the nonprofit sector in these 4 given areas and learn some lessons that we can take more broadly from there. At the same time, we see CFICE as a platform for bringing voices forward from the nonprofit sector that I think have important things to share with the rest of us. And that's really, my comments are going to back that up a little bit. So the title of this panel is Putting Our Money Where Our Mouths Are, the Federal Budget and Food Insecurity. Given this title, I expect some of my co-panelists will be bringing forward detailed policy recommendations. So I've decided that rather than bring a list forward myself, and I started making a list and I kept holding myself back from bringing that forward today. That's because I want to talk in more general terms about policymaking in the spirit of a truly participatory and deliberative democratic process, one that I'd like to see strengthened here in Ottawa. There is, I believe, an urgent need to have a more inclusive conversation about these issues, one that gives a preferential voice to those most challenged by the issues at hand, including those on the lowest incomes in Canada, Aboriginal people, farmers and fishers, as well as the organizations that represent them at these groups at the national level, such as Food Secure Canada and Inuit, Tapiriit, Kanatami, among others. So taking this approach will also give me a chance to talk about the CFICE research project that we're launching today and how we see its role in strengthening democratic debate on a number of these key social issues. So the CFICE, as a research project, is about learning how to best undertake respectful and productive partnerships between the academic sector, and that's colleges and universities as they engage in teaching and research, and the NGO community working on social and environmental issues, so that we can work together to build a stronger and more resilient Canada. In my case, I'm the co-lead of the Community Food Security Hub of the CFICE project with Cathleen Kneen of Just Food Ottawa and Food Secure Canada. So to build, our goal is, so community food security, I just want to give some context for what we're talking about today, is widely defined as a condition, and this is a direct quote, in which all community members obtain a safe, culturally appropriate, nutritionally sound diet through an economically and environmentally sustainable food system that maximizes community self-resilience, community self-reliance, social justice, and democratic decision-making. A couple things to point out there is thus community food security is not just about the household level income-related food insecurity, but about the wider food system and how well it's meeting the needs both for people being fed and an environmentally sustainable food system that also incorporates these principles of self-reliance, social justice, and democratic decision-making. So our hub is working to enhance community food security at the local level across Canada by building more and stronger working relationships between academics, especially those associated with the Canadian Association for Food Studies. So this is a key partner organization in the hub, and Food Secure Canada and its many member organizations. So these are 2 key partners. Our goal is to increase the collaboration between members of these 2 organizations so that each side can benefit from the insights and contributions of the other. We would also like to see in particular that more academics take their lead on defining their own research directions by listening to the needs of community organizations who work on the front lines. This fits with the mandate of the whole project, which is to put community first. That's the CF in our CFICE title. Since too often relationships between academics and organizations have been, I've been trying to find the right word, and I chose parasitical rather than collaborative. So that's what CFICE as a whole is about. Today's panel is about taking the spirit of academic and NGO collaboration into the realm of food policy and the federal budget in particular. So my thought is to highlight just a little bit what academics can contribute to the discussion, but then to put the focus, drawing on my own field of political science and democratic theory, on why it is important to broaden policy deliberations on these topics in Canada, to give a preferential position to voices like those of FSC and ITK. So let me just bring forward a few examples of the work of academics associated with the Canadian Association for Food Studies, whose insights I think need to be listened to by the federal government as it seeks to address food insecurity in this country. So the first example I'll bring forward is the work of Patty Williams at Mount St. Vincent University and her extensive team of community partners and academics across Nova Scotia. She's a part of the CFICE Community Food Security Hub, and her work I think is quite important. In a recent edition of Canadian Journal of Public Health, the fact that Nova Scotians dependent on income assistance they've documented the fact that Nova Scotians dependent on income assistance would face significant monthly deficits if they chose a nutritious diet based on the federal government's own guidelines, which is the National Nutritious Food Basket. Those of you working in this field know this is not a big surprise, but it just shows the disconnect between the federal guidance and what's happening on the ground. Moreover, despite incremental increases in income assistance rates over the last 10 years, the potential deficit has increased significantly between 2002 and 2010. This research effectively puts an end to any claim that people living in poverty would be able to enjoy the right to food if they just made better choices with their money. And their research is Nova Scotia focused specifically, but similar research, quantitative research has taken place across the country. Another example I want to bring forward, Rod McCrae from New York University and a past chair of the Canadian Association for Food Studies, who's a key partner in our hub, has long studied the Canadian food, trade, agriculture, and health policy domains. We don't have a food policy department, right? We don't have a food act in Canada. We don't have a national food policy. Instead, we have all these disparate policies undertaken by different departments with different aims that there are efforts to try and integrate, there are interdepartmental committees, but it's still not cohesive in the way that Rod, through many years of analysis and advice, has been trying to push. In a recent contribution to the Journal of Hunger and Environmental Nutrition, he offered detailed recommendations on how these departments can work more productively together to further sustainable agriculture, health, and poverty reduction at the same time. Finally, the numerous publications of Val Tarasic at University of Toronto in public health and nutrition journals point out that the tools typically thought to support community food security, things like food banks, community gardens, all of the community-based initiatives that are out there, while important for some, and they really are important, don't get at the nub of the issue, which is that food insecurity is an income-related issue, closely tied with housing, and that strategies to address income-related food insecurity must include revisiting social assistance rates and minimum wages. And here we get right into, what's the role of the federal government and the role of the provinces. I'm definitely one of these people who thinks that the federal government can take a leadership role on a national food strategy in this country. But like I said, I wasn't going to get into my list. These are research-based insights that need to be included in federal policy deliberations. On the other hand, I can also point to equally strong insights from the community side, all from people associated with our other main partner organization in the CFS Hub, which is Food Secure Canada. For example, in February of 2012, Paul Slump of the National Farmers Union, which is a member organization of Food Secure Canada, gave a presentation to the House of Commons Standing Committee on International Trade on the proposed comprehensive and high-level economic partnership agreement with Japan. He pointed out that past trade agreements have had many systematic negative impacts for family farmers in Canada, to the primary benefit of large transnational corporations, so that Ottawa's energies would be better directed towards developing a national food policy first before pursuing yet another round of trade negotiations. Similarly, in May of 2010, Cathleen Gibson, representing the BC Food Systems Network, which is another member of Food Secure Canada and one of the organizations that we're working with in our first round of projects in the Community Food Security Hub, she gave a presentation to the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food on the red meat supply chain, pointing out that so many of the regulatory interventions of recent decades have systematically harmed smaller meat producers at the expense of larger ones. She then outlined practical strategies for addressing this situation in Canada. So all of these little snippets of kind of research that's happening across Canada and the community-based work that's coming through Food Secure Canada, they're all meant to show that this is the kind of experience that we're trying to bring together in the CFICE project. And I challenge you to think about how community-based organizations that are working closely with researchers to get good empirical evidence to support some of their arguments, and likewise academic researchers that are really working to pursue the needs and interests of community organizations, the power that we can have over the coming years in this project in bringing these two sides together to advocate for sustainable, just, and healthy food system in Canada. In order to get there, the sustainable, just, and healthy food system in Canada, however, there's an important issue that needs to be addressed here in Ottawa. And this is what I would want to focus on the rest of my comments on today. The issue I'm referring to is a mindset that places ideology above evidence and that systematically discourages real democratic deliberation. I won't name names, but suffice it to say that we've seen a lot of this mindset in recent years in Ottawa. What would I like to see in its place? That's simple. It's known as democratic deliberation. By this, I'm referring to the core idea that I teach in my politics courses, which is that democracy really means that all those who are to be affected by a decision should have a role in making that decision. Imagine how things might look in this country if those who might be most affected by a decision would have a chance to really engage in the making of that decision. What I'm talking about here is not just representational democracy, where we vote for someone representing a party who then comes to Ottawa to toe the party line. Rather, theories of deliberative democracy suggest processes for making decisions that are inclusive of all of the perspectives of key stakeholders or groups that will be affected. Further, in my classes, I point out, drawing on Habermas and Eckersley and all these theorists that I don't have to talk about today, that truly deliberative democratic decision-making can only take place when those who are part of the debate enter with a willingness to change their minds based on what they hear from others around the table. This means a willingness to listen to both evidence and experience before forming an opinion, not just paying attention to party ideologues who themselves may only be tuned into opinion polls and the party's financial backers. Policy making based in true deliberation and inclusive of the voices of those to be most affected by decisions also gives a privileged position to organizations representing the marginalized in our society. It's only through actively including and listening to what Val Plumwood calls the voices from below that the best, and here the argument is it's the most rational, the most democratic, and the most long-range, far-sighted decisions are made from the point of view of deliberate democratic theory. I should note that the idea of voices from below is not meant in any derogatory sense, but rather as a way to characterize those individuals and communities most distanced from decisions made at the heart of a state's apparatus. In the case of food policy discussions, deliberative democratic theory encourages state to provide funding and other types of supports, much like intervening funding in court cases, to ensure that the most marginalized of our society and or their spokespeople, and that's where organizations like FSC and ITK both come in, are actively brought into policy deliberations, including a role in decision making. And I probably don't need to tell you that we've seen some cutting of this kind of funding in recent years and in recent budgets in Ottawa, and I think it's a real problem that the key Aboriginal organizations here in Ottawa that are the voices of a lot of these marginalized groups are losing their ability to bring those perspectives forward, which is partly why we have chosen to make sure those voices are heard today. While we are certainly far from seeing a truly deliberative democracy in Canada right now, I'm proud to be part of a project that is based on values that have a lot in common with deliberate democratic theory. A project that places community first and that says we need to give a priority position to voices like that of FSC and ITK in Canada's food policy discussions. So with that, I'll conclude my comments, and I'm really excited to hear what the next three panelists have to say. Thank you.
So we have, thank you very much, Peter. We have time for a couple of questions or comments for Peter. Maybe I'll ask one of you first. How many people here from the federal government today? Good. Great, welcome, thank you. How many people from the big food sector, corporate food sector, retail, production, distribution? No, no one? How many researchers, scientists in the food sector? Anybody? No? Students? Yes, and academics of one sort or another? Yes, okay, good. I think that's captured most of us. Excellent. So, community, oh, thank you, of course. Yay, all right, yeah, I'm in there too. Great, thank you. So, any questions for Peter? Well, let me perhaps just ask one, Peter, which would be in the sort of system in which the university finds itself. It is itself a distributor, vendor of food products. This is like a small city here. To what extent does CFICE and does this university address the kinds of issues that we've talked about around food security, the local food economy, and so on? Is the university itself a place where innovations or policy issues are being taken up actively?
That's a great question. The university sector, in theory, is a leader in society in bringing forward sustainability and justice in all areas, right? At least that's often what we teach and we try to get our students to get excited about, but it's not always what we practice. But I can say that here at Carleton University, there are initiatives taking place right now. I have a couple of students. Ben and Wes, do you want to raise your hands there? From last term, they were in a course with me in community-based research, and they were working on a research project to understand the Carleton food system and what where it's succeeding and where it's not. And there are, you may know that the number of food banks on campuses has grown enormously in the last number of years. A real sign, particularly international students are the ones who are going to food banks because they face really high fees. So there's been some real challenges for students on that side. And then on the sustainability issues, there have been some promising initiatives even here at Carleton and other universities where they're getting more locally produced food and cage-free eggs in their, addressing some of the social and environmental issues around the food system. It's slow, but there's progress happening here at Carleton, I'd say, through a research project and efforts to bring various stakeholders together across campus to really talk about these issues. And I think those kind of those stakeholder committees is one way that kind of the deliberative democratic process can start in relation to our food system here. And I know there's initiatives across the country at universities to do that kind of thing. So we're not leaders, but there's some progress being made.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, then I think we'll move on to our next speaker, Mr. Terry Audla, who is an Inuit leader who's held progressively senior policy and management positions within governments and government agencies that emerged from the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement in 1993. In June 2012, he was elected president of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, or ITK, Canada's National Inuit Association. We're especially honored to have Mr. Audla with us today. He's going to speak about Inuit food systems and food security in the Arctic. Thank you. Please welcome Terry.
Good morning, everyone. Again, thank you, Stephen, and thank you to the organizers, the Food Secure Canada and Community First Impacts of Community Engagement, for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm delighted to be here to provide a perspective on the food security situation for Canadian Inuit and the subsequent effects of the federal budget. When I was preparing for this morning's presentation, I was trying to think of what perspectives I could provide that would be unique to the conversation. After some reflecting, I decided that I would focus on two things that are particularly unique for Inuit here in Canada, and how one of those things is a strength and the other an ongoing challenge. The first distinction that I wanted to talk about is the Inuit food system. Inuit have lived for thousands of years in Arctic Canada. Inuit Nunavut, or the Inuit homeland, is one of the most beautiful and unique areas in the world. Yes, it can be cold. Just last week, the temperature in Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, was around minus 52 degrees. Where I grew up in Resolute Bay, which is further north in the high Arctic, I've seen minus 75. But it can be warm as well during the summer months. And in the winter, it can be dark. But some say it might be worth it to have 24 hours of sunshine in the summer. Where I grew up, I've never seen the sun in December. So when I first came down and saw the sun in December, it blew me away, and I thought, how can people live like this? But some people call the Arctic harsh. I call it home. Today, there are 53 Inuit communities in the 4 regions. The Inuit Settlement Region in the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, the newly created territory, Nunavik, which is in northern Quebec, and Nunatsiavut in northern Labrador. Most of these communities are small, with a third of them having populations under 500. As you can imagine, these communities are also very remote and far removed from major centers. All but one have access and can only be reached by air or sea during the summer months. The uniqueness of the Inuit food system from the south is largely a result of the uniqueness of our environment. Before there was contact made from the south, Inuit relied completely on the richness of the land. It hasn't been until relatively recently that market food shipped from southern areas have become part of our everyday diet. Yet despite the introduction of the market foods, Inuit still consume a variety of country food, including caribou, walrus, polar bear, narwhal, beluga, bowhead whale, seal, fish, berries, and many more depending on the region. Country food still remains a very important part of our diet, not only because of its unmatched nutritional, economic, and physical health benefits, but also because of its significant cultural importance. Country food remains at the center of Inuit identity and well-being. Just to illustrate how Inuit view country food, I was looking at the poster for today's session with all these great-looking vegetables. This poster right here. I was thinking, I've never seen some of these. And then, these are the foods that Inuit most closely identify with. And Inuit would tend towards a great-looking seal. So I said our food system is one aspect that is unique to the Inuit culture. And it is an aspect of our culture that we struggle to keep alive because of the second uniqueness that I want to speak about, and that is the food insecurity situation for Inuit. The prevalence of food insecurity is very high in Inuit communities compared to the rest of Canada. Factors such as high cost of food, high poverty rates, lack of availability, variety and quality of foods, climate change, and environmental contamination, among others, are negatively impacting our communities. The cost of market foods in Arctic communities can be astronomically high. In Ottawa, many people wouldn't dream of paying $200 for a turkey, or $28 for cabbage, or $105 for a case of 24 bottles of water. But this can be the price to eat in the Arctic. I mentioned how important country food is to Inuit, but the cost of snow machines, guns, ammunition, and gas to go hunting can also be high and therefore out of reach for many Inuit who are living below the poverty line. Availability, variety, and quality of foods are ongoing issues in many communities. Nutritious, perishable food can be especially hard to come by in communities because they are so vulnerable to damage and spoilage from the great distances they must travel. Climate change is being felt most strongly in the Arctic and is leading to changes in the migration, ranges, and numbers of some animals and plants that we rely on. Also affects the weather patterns and how we use the prevailing winds and ice conditions for navigation purposes. Environmental contaminants which originate in southern populated areas continue to travel up north and pollute the Arctic ecosystem. High levels of these contaminants are accumulating in many species of animals and plants. Since Inuit rely on these foods, levels of exposure to some contaminants, such as mercury, have been found to exceed recommended safety guidelines among certain Inuit populations. Now we must weigh the significant benefits from eating country food with the potential risks from exposure to contaminants. These challenges, among others, have led to the food insecurity situation that Inuit must struggle with today. The Nunavut Inuit Children's Health Survey found that nearly 70% of Inuit preschoolers live in food insecure households. The Inuit Health Survey found high prevalence rates among the regions, the highest being in Nunavut, where 68.8% of households are food insecure. This is 6 times higher than the Canadian national average and represents the highest documented food insecurity rate for any Aboriginal population residing in a developed country. Too many Inuit are struggling to access food in Canada. Food insecurity for Inuit is posing a serious risk to our well-being through the negative impacts on our nutrition, physical, psychological, and social health. And in reference to our country food, it is also threatening the very continuity of our culture. Despite this dire situation, I believe that it can be improved. There are many individuals, communities, and organizations that are working to mitigate the food insecurity situation facing Inuit in Canada. Many initiatives, programs, and strategies are being developed to address these challenges. There are greenhouses in a number of communities, hunter support programs, community freezer programs. The Nunavut Food Security Coalition held a symposium last week as part of the development of a Nunavut food security strategy, and Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami is currently working on a national Inuit food security strategy, just to name a few. However, to adequately address the food insecurity situation for Inuit, the government must also be invested in its betterment. Solutions must incorporate the unique obstacles and extraordinary costs that face Arctic regions. Ultimately, the purpose of the federal budget is to bolster fundamental strengths in Canada while addressing challenges that exist in this country. Investments that support Inuit traditional ways of life and accessibility to market foods are examples of ways to enhance the strength of our food system and the challenge of food insecurity in our communities. Also critical is investing in the well-being of Inuit population through key issues such as education, housing, and infrastructure, mental wellness, and health. Inuit graduation rates are the lowest in the country. It is an important investment in the future of Inuit youth to be educated and have the tools necessary for employment. There is an urgent need to provide more funding to education in all of the Inuit regions. The Inuit population is the fastest growing in the country. Many Inuit are living in overcrowded homes, which has a negative impact on their health. Funds need to be devoted to the region for new builds, replacement, and maintenance of infrastructure, and the current supply of affordable housing is not able to keep pace. Mental health is a critical issue in many Inuit communities, particularly among Inuit youth. Funding needs to be directed to improve mental wellness support among the regions. The rate of chronic and infectious diseases is often high among Inuit compared to the rest of the Canadian population. For example, the rate of tuberculosis infections for Inuit is 174 times higher than the rest of Canada. Attention needs to be directed at programs and initiatives that work to eradicate these disparities. During my opening remarks, I concentrated on 2 things that are unique for Canadian Inuit. However, I wanted to end by focusing on a similarity. Everyone that is in this room has at least one thing in common, and that is that we all live in Canada, and the other is that we need to put food on the table. Everyone here, we are fortunate enough to live in this country, which prides itself on many things, including equality, wealth, the health system, democracy, high standard of living, and diversity. Canada is one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world, and I think that is something that needs to be celebrated. It is a strength, and it makes Canadians unique. Despite all these qualities that make Canada great, there are still many people in this country who lack available, accessible, and adequate food. And this is particularly and uniquely true for Inuit here in Canada, who unfortunately struggle with food insecurity on a daily basis. There are far too many Inuit who today will have to skip a meal, not eat at all, or will go to bed hungry. And in a country such as Canada, even one is too many. Because as Canadians, we should be unique because of our diversity, not for our adversities. Thank you. Hoyanami.
Thank you very much, Terry, for that sobering report. Questions or comments for Terry? Anyone? Yeah, just ask. Yes, go ahead.
Terry, I wonder if you could speak specifically about the food mail program that was ended and its replacement, and where, because I understand there's been some challenges around the replacement program and where that's at.
The food mail
Everyone
program.
hear the question? No. Could you repeat it a little louder? Can we
Sorry, yeah, my mic's on. So I was asking Terry about there was a food mail program that provided subsidies to mail food into the far north, into other difficult to reach parts of Canada. And then my understanding is the Conservative government removed that program and replaced it with another. I can't remember the name of it, and I'm just wondering what the experience has been with that in Inuit communities.
Well, the food mail program, or the subsidy program to have food from southern Canada shipped up north and to sort of augment the cost of shipping north and buying those types of foods. The name of it really has been changed to the Nutrition North program, and that was to encourage Inuit to buy foods that are nutritious outside of the country food that's available. The jury's still out on whether or not that's working. I understand the federal initiative, but as people down here know, whenever the federal system tries to get involved with what types of food you need to eat, then there's usually public outcry, and I'll have my sodium, thank you. But that's the thing, is that Inuit in Arctic Canada need to take advantage of it, but there's very little means or ways of taking advantage of that type of program based on the fact that the poverty levels are so high. And I'll give you an example. In one of the northern communities of Sanikiloa, we have local stores. They have the main store, then they have the convenience store. And I just happened to ask the manager of that store how business was. And he sort of put his head down and started shaking his head and suggested that the convenience store was making more money than the main store. And what was in that convenience store? Soda pop, chips, chocolate bars. So there was a lot of money being made from that. And how do we get our population to actually start, choosing the right types of food is I think one main question that's sort of attached to that, and how we can get sort of turn around or sort of head off at the pass the rearing of its ugly head, diabetes, and how that's going to become a major issue in the north, and how we can bring about more nutritional decisions towards what it is that you put in your mouth.
My name is Leo Doyle, and I'm the director for the Nutrition North Canada program. So I can shed a little bit of light on the transition from the food mail program to Nutrition North. Historically, for about the last 50 years thereabout, the Government of Canada, via Canada Post up until 1991, subsidized the shipment of sort of all order of goods into isolated northern communities via Canada Post. And what happened post-1999 and the creation of Iqaluit, program costs have been fairly stable. And then after the creation of Nunavut and Iqaluit as the capital, there was a spike in terms of the cost of delivering the program, and it just kept going up and up, 12, 14% per year. And there was a perception that the program was spending more and more money, but the people most intended to benefit weren't actually benefiting from it. So poor and low-income people. In fact, the program was probably making things worse because with the advent of the use of faxes, 1-800 numbers, and the internet, increasingly in these communities, and Mr. Audla noted that about a third of communities have 500 or fewer. So if you have a store in a community that has 500 people and you're operating a grocery store, I live a 10-minute walk from this university in the community of Old Ottawa South, which is one of the richest communities in all of Canada. And the little groceteria that we had in the community closed a number of years ago and was closed for several years, and people were advocating and lobbying, and these were my neighbors are some of the richest, most policy sophisticated, and biggest pests in the world in terms of trying to, if you want a new business or you want something to happen. And in the end, the best, they did convince somebody to operate and run a little groceteria in this neighborhood of about 8,000 people, average household income about 130,000. And yet someone determines that there's not a business case to have a grocery store. So you can imagine in a community of 500 or sub 500 people, you're operating a grocery store and you have a food mail program where Canada Post doesn't really care what they're shipping in or to whom. And so what increasingly happened was everybody in an isolated northern community who was a teacher or an RCMP officer or a civil servant could pretty much order whatever they needed from Winnipeg or from Montreal or from Yellowknife. And the poorest of the poor, overwhelmingly Aboriginal people with low incomes, were dependent on these teeny tiny little local grocery stores that were losing all of their best customers. And so a modest change was to get Canada Post, which desperately wanted to get out of the delivery of food, because whenever we talked to Canada Post, they would say we're a parcel and mail company. We're not really a food delivery company. It's not really what we know. And Canada Post would say the other thing is what the food mail program does is put us in a strange situation where we have to procure for the absolute largest airplane we can get to ship all the food in. And there's only about 1 or 2 airlines that have really, really big airplanes that are going to serve the North. And so we have to kind of take whatever price they offer. So what Canada Post has discovered, now that they're out of the food delivery, their mail delivery prices have gone down. And the retailers who actually ship most of the volume, their price of shipping the food into the communities has gone down. But Food Mail and Nutrition North more or less still have about the same budget. But we've been able to ship about 5 million kg more of food with the exact same money. But I think, as Terry pointed out, that a real challenge is just that in these communities overwhelmingly, and Professor Andree pointed out as well, the big challenge is that people are really, really poor. And so a market food system of shopping at the groceries when people traditionally, country food was what's most meaningful to them, the biggest source of sustenance, isn't something that that this particular federal program was designed to address. So that ought to be part of the discussion. I've taken up too much time.
Thank you. Another question?
Thank you. Great presentation. About a year ago, there was a UN representative in Canada discussing food security and food insecurity. And what I recall is that there was a federal minister, I think it was the federal health minister, who in response made comments that I think a lot of people found dismissive vis-a-vis the UN representative's statements about food insecurity in Canada's north. Could you maybe respond to those comments? And I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly what she said, but I don't want to misconstrue it. But.
Yeah, I remember her response. It was somewhat dismissive, but at the same time, there was some truth behind that dismissive statement. And basically, what she told the UN rapporteur was that you can't be placing your opinions on an area where you've never visited, and that what threatens the food security of Northerners are animal rights activists. There's some elements of truth to that. As part of my job representing the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami a large part of my time has been spent on defending the polar bear hunt. Because right now, globally, there's pressures from animal rights groups to stop the trade of polar bear and its pelt. When you consider the seal ban, for example, in the 70s, Inuit communities were very healthy, very self-reliant, and were able to augment the cost of harvesting seals through the salad up pelt. But all of a sudden, that market was decimated based on the U.S. ban. And again, it wasn't based on any facts. It was based on people's heartstrings and the judgment of the cruelty to that hunt. Fast forward to now, we're facing the same issue with the polar bear. Climate change is being used as the reasoning behind putting towards a proposal of stopping the hunt. But again, Inuit reliance on the little income that is derived from the salad pelt is again working towards decimating that reliance and the self-reliance on being able to hunt the polar bear based on, again, untruths. Whereas within the Canadian system, the management of the polar bear with the Inuit and government has been very beneficial to the polar bear population, to the conservation of the bear. 2/3 of the world global population is in Canada, and the populations have increased. But again, it's animal rights activists that are trying to dictate and judge what we eat. Where in Canada's Arctic, as I said, we have very little choice and means for income. So there is that element of truth into it as well. And at the same time, we encourage the UN Rapporteur or anyone else that is going to develop any policy or suggest any change, that they come up north and see the realities and work with that.
Thank you. And question from Diana, and then I think after that we'll move on to our next speaker.
I actually just wanted to comment on the issue of the special rapporteur also coming to Canada, just to put that in a bit of context. It's true that Olivier Descouteurs did not go north of 60 when he came to Canada. He did go to northern Alberta and northern Manitoba, and he did visit with remote communities and a number of Aboriginal communities. The primary reason, I think, why he did not go north of 60 was financial, and it's related to the cost of food and the cost of getting there. He had a team of 3 people working with him. He works in a voluntary capacity. He's not paid for his job as a special rapporteur, and any funds that he raises for his assistants who work with him and help him write his reports, are scraped together. They're not highfalutin UN salaries. And so it would have cost them over $10,000 to go north for a few days, and they decided to receive electronic communications and speak with people in Ottawa and other communities in that regard. But with regard to Leona Aglacook's comments that called him patronizing and ill-informed and so on, first of all, he never did anything to associate himself with any animal rights activists who would be condemning the seal or the polar bear hunt. Quite the contrary, in his preliminary report, he did defend country foods as an essential part of reaching food security. I guess I'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about his report, because on March 4th this year, he will formally present that report to the United Nations in Geneva. And we will be hosting, Food Secure Canada will be hosting an interactive webinar with him so that people will have a chance to talk directly with him about his findings. And we really hope that the Government of Canada will not have the same dismissive attitude that it did last year, which was really very, very unfortunate and unprecedented in terms of the treatment that a UN official received. Canada is a signatory to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It is therefore bound to submit itself to UN investigations. He was here at the invitation of the Government of Canada, who facilitated meetings as did we facilitate meetings, as did the AFN facilitate meetings. We tried to make sure that he would meet a maximum number of people. And I think, you know, on the heels of Canada withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol and what that has done to Canada's reputation in terms of our commitment to UN treaties and what our signature is worth, should give us some reason for pause, because were we to treat the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights as we treat the Protocol on Climate Change, that'll be very, very serious indeed. We are amongst the first and longest standing signatories of that convention. It comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I'm sure you all know was drafted, amongst others, by a Canadian, John Humphrey. And it's quite shocking to think what would happen if Olivier de Schuiter's report is dismissed in the same way on March 4th when he presents it to the United Nations as it was in the press theater here in Ottawa last May.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Let's move on now to Cathleen Kneen, a movement builder, mentor for many of us, a champion for a just and sustainable food system. She worked on the landmark People's Food Policy Project, and with her husband Brewster publishes a food policy journal called The Ram's Horn. She's also the chair of Just Food, a local food hub here in Ottawa. Her presentation will focus on the current situation regarding food insecurity in Canada and efforts to reform it to address population health, a stable economy, and ecological sustainability. Please welcome Cathleen Kneen.
Well, thank you. I have a dear friend who said to me not long ago, you know, I get up every morning and I say, dear Creator, may this be a day when I do not have to learn humility again. And I have discovered the lifelong learning. I learned a new thing again this morning, that is, don't make assumptions. I had made an assumption that there would be a PowerPoint here. I didn't check with anybody. I just made that assumption. I'm in a university. Of course there's PowerPoint. Well, there isn't. So that's interesting. I changed a little bit of what I was going to say. I also made the assumption, so technology isn't necessarily there when you need it, is the assumption, okay? The take-home message. The other take-home message is that systems don't necessarily work when you expect them to. Brewster and I waited at the bus stop and waited and waited and waited and finally did plan B and got here. But now systems aren't always reliable. So I'm supposed to be talking about food insecurity and the Canadian food movement. And listening to Terry reminded me that, well, the reason I wanted to have the PowerPoint was because I'm a very visual person. And I tend to think in pictures and metaphors, and I wanted to show you some pictures. I may describe a few of them. But let me start with one which Terry reminded me of in terms of the contamination of country food. The way I think many people felt when they learned that women's breast milk was being contaminated. And you have to choose between breastfeeding your baby and possibly opening the door to serious problems, or using a technical alternative of formula with all the problems that that entails. And the reason why I thought about it is that breastfeeding is really, if we want to have a vision, we've heard a definition of what a sustainable food system is like, but if you want to have a vision of a sustainable food system, in food security, I would say breastfeeding is a pretty good picture to have in your head. I mean, just think about it. First of all, the consumer is in control. Some people here have been through this process, I can tell. The food is designed specifically for the need of the consumer, and it varies in both quantity and quality as those needs change. That's how it works. There's no fossil fuel used in the production of this food. There's no excess packaging. The packaging is infinitely reusable and very attractive. There is a direct relationship, not to say an intimate relationship, between the producer and, for the sake of shorthand, I'll say the consumer. It may take a while to get that relationship established, and we're going to be talking about that more this morning, I expect. But once it's established, it has positive repercussions for both the producer and the consumer. And finally, and this is where we get into where things start to break down in our system, if the producer is not well nourished, the food isn't there, and the relationship and the system break down. So I'm implying, and you've already heard, that the producers of our food are not well nourished, are not well cared for. In fact, they're going out of business hand over fist. I can give you some statistics if you like. Let's see, in the last 5 years, we've lost something like 10% of Canadian farmers. But this goes back a long way further back than the last 5 years. Some of you may remember Gene Whalen, the late great agriculture minister with his green sombrero. It wasn't sombrero, cowboy hat. And that's sort of where I came into this picture, started farming in 1971 with Brewster. And at that point, we were aware that it was federal policy to get rid of small-scale farmers, to emphasize large-scale commodity production. And the same thing was true of the fisheries. We discovered that through the People's Food Commission, which was started in 1978 and completed its work in 1980, which was modeled on the Pipeline Commission, except that it was all volunteer, which made it a little bit more, kind of a bit more like Olivia de Scuder's exercise. We had to scrape together money to make it happen. But what happened to me as a young farmer was that I met fisher people who were in the same boat, excuse me, sorry, I didn't mean to say that, who were in this, I really didn't, who were in the same situation as we were. So they were watching the industrialization of the fisheries, and they said, you know, that the factory trawler, the big freezer trawler, is the structural equivalent of the combine harvester. So if you see what's happening, it's happening in both the fisheries. Now that was back in 1980, and the northern cod was still flourishing. Now, of course, I'm a Newfoundlander, so this upsets me terribly. It's disappeared. It was the richest fishery the world had ever seen. I mean, talk about a canary in a coal mine, folks. Okay, the purpose of this was an ideological fixation on an economy which was based on commodity import and export. And so Canada was to export red meat, fish, and grain, and import everything else. And the assumption behind that is that it doesn't matter where it comes from. It's kind of like the assumption, and God help me, I remember as a young farmer before I knew, because I wasn't trained as a farmer, I came into it from town, I was a townie. I actually remember hearing myself saying, well, the plant doesn't care where it gets its molecule of nitrogen, potassium, or phosphorus from. I was really, really wrong. The plant cares a great deal. And actually, if you want to pick up the latest issue of the Ramshorn, there's a lovely article in there that explains something of what's the manner in which the plant cares. But it also matters where our food comes from. It's one thing to say we can have a trading system, and I'm not against trade at all. I mean, I'm as committed as anybody else in the room to the big 3 C's, you know, coffee, caffeine, chocolate, and citrus. So I want trade. But if we are not able to provide the basic foods that the population requires, any jurisdiction that can't basically feed its people is at the mercy of whoever does. So if we're really interested, I mean, let's get patriotic here. If we're really interested in having a country called Canada, which has the potential to be actually a democracy, as has been eloquently discussed earlier, where the people who live in the situation have the opportunity to make the decisions governing their lives, then we have got to be able to feed ourselves. We have to have a food system which enables us to feed ourselves. And we don't have it now. As I said, we've not only lost all these farmers and fisher people, we've also, again, as has been pointed out, we have massive food insecurity in this country. I mean, it's really crazy. Shortly after the People's Food Commission, it was in 1981 that the first food banks were created. And I remember it well because it was one of those short-term stopgap things. 10 years max, we'll have this one licked. But right now, you know, we need to have food banks where people can put in food and people can take out food. That was kind of the image. Food banks are now a part of the industrial food system. And I call it industrial because it's based on the manufacturing process. You know, it's efficiency and speed and single-way, one-way flow. And that's where you see the food comes from here and it goes over there, and it's got to go over there. So if it doesn't get sold out of the supermarket or from the distributor, then it goes into the landfill or a surrogate landfill, which is the hungry. That's how the structure works. And if that sounds disgusting, it's because it is disgusting. The other piece of the commodity shift, of course, again, as has been referred to, is that the whole system is now controlled by a shrinking number of very large corporate actors. And one of the drawings I was going to show you, as I do these drawings for the ram's horn, shows two figures holding a skipping rope, and the globe is doing double Dutch skipping. And the skipping rope, one is labeled Monsanto and the other is labeled Cargill. So the world's largest grain trader and the world's largest seed company and also biotechnology company. So left out the agrotoxins for the moment, but they're back in there in the background. And at the retail level, you see the same thing. There's a shrinking number of very large corporations, and now we see Walmart coming in as being a major food retailer. Who knew? Walmart Organics coming to a mega store near you. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the good news. Since the People's Food Commission, there has been a growing movement across Canada in every place you can mention to recapture the basics of the food system. And yes, many of those, as Stephen said, are quite small and very local and don't perhaps amount to a whole lot more than growing a tomato plant on your balcony. But I've talked to people who grew up on the 7th floor of a high-rise somewhere where you couldn't even hammer a nail into the wall to hang a picture, who decided they wanted to do something about food, and they grew a tomato plant on their balcony. And it wasn't about the tomatoes. It was about, back to breastfeeding, it was about the relationship that they developed with food and the way in which they started thinking differently about food. One of the big problems we've got is waste. One of the reasons for food waste, I mean, aside from the obvious that we have this system which requires cosmetic perfection and has all the slippages that is in a very, very large system, is that if you don't respect something, then you won't use it as well as you do if you do respect it. If it's been hard work to get there, then you have more respect for it. And so in the same way as a potter, I found that people who had tried to make pottery really appreciated my pottery. People who've tried to grow food really appreciate food and will not waste it. They will care for it, and they will actually, surprisingly, pay more for it because they see the value in it. So these little efforts to reclaim tiny pieces of the food system have potential to change the whole system on the basis of a completely different vision because it's developing different kinds of relationships. Now, that doesn't mean that we will tomorrow get rid of Walmart Organics. We won't. But it does mean that we have the potential to see the building blocks, if you like, of a different kind of system and put them in place. One of the pieces of those building blocks, of course, is policy. It's all very well to do this at the grassroots level. We also have to change the way in which government and business does business. That's called policy. And in most of my experience as a community organizer, I found that when I say the word policy, people go, and their eyes kind of glaze over, and their heads nod, and they, you know, I mean, I don't mean nod like this, I mean nod like this. But policy is simply the guidelines by which decisions are made. The federal budget, which Diana is going to talk about, is a primary policy document. It shows how decisions are being made. And you've got a food policy. Everybody in this room has some guidelines about what you will eat and what you won't eat, what you will buy and where you will buy it, and where you will not go to buy your food. And it can have to do with a disease. You can say, okay, I'm not eating gluten. You can say, I want to support the local economy, and therefore I'm going to spend as much money as I possibly can in my food budget locally. Or it can simply be, I am not going to eat a Mexican tomato in February because it tastes like cardboard. So, you know, I can tomatoes and eat those instead. So there's lots of different kinds of food policies, but the basic thing, and this was a really important tool that we've used in first of all, the BC Food Systems Network, where I was organizing, and then in Food Secure Canada, was to help people see, yes, you have a food policy, and you are a citizen. Put those two pieces together, and the next thing you do is look, as we did in the People's Food Policy Project, look at where is the gap and where are the contradictions between your food policy and what you want for yourself and your family and the food policy which is being implemented by the federal government. Because there is a food policy. It's just not about feeding the population. It's about feeding corporations and the bottom line and import, export, and trade. So the gap, then, is where we have to address our efforts. And fortunately, that's not that hard. There are many, many things we can do. And I just want to, before I finish, I just want to show you a couple of other pictures. One is one that I did at the time where we were dealing with XL Foods. And it shows a little bug in a trench coat with a, what do you call that, a Glock? And he's labeled Agent 05, what was it? 0589? And the caption is, the name is coli, E. coli. So the point of this is that any large system like XL Foods or Cargill Foods or any of the other huge giant processing plants carries immense risk. And so if we are concerned, as we are very much in Canada, about public health, so one thing that comes on the top of every poll is our healthcare system is what we really, really care about, then we are going to have to dismantle that large structure because it is dangerous to our health. The other one is our addiction to oil. Clearly, there are some issues here. The fact is, according to some recent studies out of France, that if, as it looks like we're very much on track to do, we increase the global temperature by 4 degrees Celsius, some 30% of our food production will be failed by 2050. So the drawing I have is a little figure, I guess it looks like Stephen Harper, with a fire hose that's coming out of a black patch called tar sands, and it's aimed at a globe which is burning. So keep those images in your mind, and I think you'll see where we'll be able to make some changes.
Okay, thank you. One question for Kathleen? Yes, over here. And then I'm just in light of time, I think we're going to have to keep it to one because we're going to bump up against the other speaker's time. So please go ahead.
Todd Barr from the Trent Center for Community-Based Education and past chair of the Canadian Alliance for Community Service Learning. Thanks so much for your talk. Question, you talked about this idea of the need to feed families and this idea of local food production as in some ways being at odds with a federal policy that's focused on a trade and import and export and whatnot. But I wonder if you could talk, anyone, but perhaps you, Kathleen, to speak to actually the connection between economy and the ideas that you're talking about in terms of that local connection, that feeding your family, because I think there is, it's not that the two are separated, but that there's perhaps a different perspective on economic development as it relates to some of the ideas you talked about.
Sounds to me like you could probably answer your question yourself.
I want to hear from you.
I can't remember the multiplier at this point. The last one I saw was that for every full-time farmer, that is a small-scale local family farmer, there are 7 jobs in the community. There's a whole economic development, which Todd can speak to much better than I can, a whole economic development practice that is based on the understanding that a secure and resilient economy is one which employs people and employs people in a way which is sustainable, which is not using up the resources of the earth. I had the good fortune last night to see a film called Shift Change, which is done by Bullfrog Films, if you want to look it up. And it's about Mondragon, the famous co-op town in northern Spain, and the way in which those interlocked cooperative enterprises are being replicated in the U.S. in various different places, in Cleveland and in parts of Wisconsin in particular. And what was made very clear was that as with people taking responsibility for their own food, when people take responsibility for their own place of employment, the whole model changes and it becomes much more resilient. And that, I think, is the piece that's most important. That the thing that troubles me about the economy that we've got now is it's so fragile. It's so brittle. You know, climate change, there are so many threats that can so easily throw the whole thing over. And who will suffer worst is the poor, immediately, those who are least sheltered. So the resilience of small-scale, non-fossil fuel dependent, non-chemical and input dependent agriculture, I think is the key to a completely different type of economy.
Okay. Actually, I'm going to ask you to hold till we'll try and have a little bit more discussion at the end. I do think, though, we have to give you an opportunity to answer the question that you've raised about Walmart Organics. If we're talking about shifting a large system in the interests of resiliency and so on, I think we should acknowledge that the federal government has adopted and helped an organic standard come into being. Yeah. Why is that you're concerned that that isn't, or would say that that isn't, in fact, a huge step forward? Is there a quick comment you could make about that, or should we leave that to Diane?
I will quote Terry, the jury's out.
Okay, all right.
I was part of that process. I'm very skeptical of that process. Mm-hmm. And I think the issue, again, comes back to what is the system that best creates relationships? And I'm not sure it's Walmart Organics.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let us move on to our next speaker, Diana Bronson, whose intro I have here. Diana is the Executive Director of Food Secure Canada, a McConnell grantee, I would add, with a background in journalism and human rights. More recently, she worked with technology watchdog, the ETC Group, known globally for its work in supporting food sovereignty and biodiversity. Her remarks today will address the absence of a national food policy, the need for a national student nutrition strategy, and the federal government to become active in bringing together all levels of government along with the private sector and local actors to address food insecurity. Please welcome Diana Bronson.
Thanks very much. Thanks to CFICE for organizing this event, and thanks to everybody who's presented before me. I feel it's always interesting to speak last. You try and strike things off, but in a way they all get replaced with more things you want to say. So apologies for that. I'll try and keep to my time so that we can have some discussion. I do want to focus mainly on the budget, because I think that's what we advertised for this event, and I'd like to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty. I just would like to say a few things about Food Secure Canada before I go into my remarks. Food Secure Canada is a network of organizations and individuals brought together around three main priorities. That is zero hunger, healthy and safe food for all, and sustainable food systems. And of course, you could unpack every one of those three things. And we do a little bit in this publication, which is outside, which Cathleen alluded to. It's called Resetting the Table, a People's Food Policy for Canada. And this really was an exercise in deliberative democracy that Peter Andree talked about, where some 3,500 people over about 3 years brought together at kitchen table talks across the country, worked, as farmers and activists and people operating student nutrition programs and gardeners and cooks, brought their collective wisdom together and designed what could be and what should be a food policy for Canada. Of course, we wouldn't expect the government to necessarily adopt everything in the People's Food Policy, but we do think it's a very good starting point. And nor is it the only discussion on food policy in town, and perhaps we can get into that in the table, in the debate. Well, Cathleen says we have a national food policy, and that's one way to say it. I would say we don't have a national food policy. What we have is a haphazard patchwork of policies put together in various government silos, where the obvious connections that need to be drawn between agriculture and health and environment and trade, just to mention those four, are not being drawn. And these policies are not being thought of together. And that is turning out to be very, very costly in the long term. I actually have a piece in iPolitics this morning that lays out what some of those costs are. For example, just to cite one figure, the diet-related chronic diseases in Canada cost our economy roughly $93 billion. We could do a lot better with fairly modest resources if we would start talking about healthy diets more systematically throughout our society, and helping along, as Cathleen pointed out, the producers of food, the producers of healthy food, who are going out of business at an alarming rate. So as an organization that convenes organizations and interested individuals across the country around these three priorities, we decided to try and tackle the federal budget this year for reasons you all know very well, and that Idle No More has brought home in a very clear way to all of us. The federal budget is the most important piece of legislation that the federal government passes in any given year, I would argue, or in most given years. One could conceive of other equally important pieces of legislation, but particularly with what we pack into it these days, the federal budget is a crucial piece. So what is happening, what is not happening, and what should be done? Well, what is not happening is a federal food policy or a process that would lead us towards one. This was part of the Conservative Party's platform in the last election. In fact, it was part of the party platforms of all 5 parties in the House of Commons to have a national food policy. But there's been no process of engagement. If you consult the lobbying records of some of our biggest food companies, you can see that they're still lobbying the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food for a national food policy, but there is no public discussion whatsoever on the government side about what is going on in terms of a national food policy. Indeed, the government seems to have transformed itself into a stakeholder of an industry-led process, which is run by the Conference Board of Canada. And you may have heard the recent consultations that the Conference Board is holding on its so-called national food strategy, and they'll be having a big summit in April in Toronto. But the government, or certain government departments, both provincial and federal, actually sit around that table more as stakeholders rather than conveners of a process, which is what we think they should be. So we called in our submission, in our electronic submission, and then before the Committee on Finance, when we were invited to appear, for the establishment of a cross-sectoral, multi-stakeholder dialogue that would begin a conversation about how to bring these issues together. Now, in an era when the government seems intent on becoming smaller and is not exactly forward-looking when it comes to federal policy or federal standards or federal leadership, I'm not holding my breath that that's going to happen, even though it's quite obvious to me that that would be the right thing to happen. But even in the absence of a dialogue towards a national food policy that we desperately need, there are small steps that could be taken that would make a big difference and that we would like to see in the federal budget when it comes down, presumably in March. I don't think a date has yet been announced. And we've written up some of these ideas for the first time this year. I don't know how many people in the room know of the alternative federal budget? Yeah, a few people, so that's good. So the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has done that for a number of years. They've put forward an alternative federal budget, and this year it will have the first ever chapter on food. So we're trying to work on the alternative side as well, to actually cost out and budget what would be required to turn food policy a little bit around. And we had an assembly of our membership in Edmonton, and one of the resounding conclusions of that assembly was that if we could not move anything else forward, perhaps we could move forward this idea of a national, federally led student nutrition program. These programs exist all over OECD countries, indeed in many countries that are not OECD countries. And basically what they do is provide kids in elementary and in secondary schools with either a breakfast or a mid-morning snack. The research is quite unanimous on the benefits of such programs. We know that 40% of elementary school students and 60% of high school students don't eat breakfast before going to school, and that actually inhibits their learning. It causes more students to drop out. It makes them less concentrated. It reduces their capacity of their memory to function properly. And it doesn't cost very much. And all across this country, we have programs that are led by school boards and communities and parents. There's private sector actors, the municipalities and the provincial governments are all involved right across the country. But there's no federal contribution. So what Food Secure Canada called upon the federal government to do was its fair share, which would be to pick up 20% of the costs, which would allow those programs to serve better food to more kids who need that food to learn properly during the day. So we costed that out, and for 20% of the cost of the program, we figure for about $550 million, which I know sounds a lot to people in this room, but it's not really that much in terms of the overall federal budget. We could make a significant difference in expanding these programs. And of course, they should be sourcing local food and healthy food and not serving up junk to kids in the morning. We came up with a number of other recommendations as well. For example, we talked a little bit here about local procurement and the benefits of that to local economies. The federal government, buys an awful lot of food, particularly in this town. Why would they not begin to set targets for federal government agencies that a certain percentage of their food should be sourced locally from local farmers? Why not support organizations like Local Food Plus, who is a member of Food Secure Canada, that certifies local food, not only for its environmental, but also for its social impacts? Why not help by setting up the infrastructure and the marketing and the farmers markets and all of those things that would make local food easier? There's a cross-Canada coalition called Farm to Cafeteria Canada that's doing very, very interesting work in trying to get schools and so on to buy more local food. But instead, as you've probably heard, we are negotiating trade agreements that are actually going to undermine the capacity of municipalities to give preferential access to their markets to local farmers or local food producers. Another thing that we could be doing much, much better than we are is supporting family farms. We've quadrupled our exports, and we've lost 2/3 of our family farms in the post-war period. We've got bigger and bigger farms growing fewer and fewer things. 75% of farmers want to pass it on in the next 10 years. The average age of a farmer in Canada is 54. None of this is a sign of a healthy agricultural economy. We need to create programs to make it possible for young people to go into farming. It's very, very tough for young people to get access to the credit they need if they are interested in farming. We need to have some net income targets for farmers. It's not enough to just have insurance when there's crop failures. We need to know that all farmers can meet a basic core minimum standard. And there needs to be retirement saving programs and other financial supports for farmers, for all farmers, not just the big ones. We also came up with some recommendations on Nutrition North, and I think Terry has spoken in some detail about the problems of food security in the North. I think it's true that it's a new program, and the jury is very much out. I understand it's going to go through an evaluation in the coming year. I hope that's an evaluation that will solicit the input of all the different stakeholders who are very, very interested in that program. 70% is a shocking, shocking statistic for food insecurity in the North. In fact, the statistics are quite shocking across the country. 17% for the average Indigenous adult in this country. 3.9 million Canadians who experience some form of food insecurity. 2.1 million Canadians who experience severe or moderate food insecurity, according to the research of Val Tarasek, who's also participating in this project. So we have a lot of work to do, and we're working in quite a difficult context. So I don't want to leave with a depressing note of where we're at. I do thank you very much for coming this morning. I hope you find our presentations informative. I invite you to continue to connect with Food Secure Canada. Individuals and organizations are most welcome to be members. Like all nonprofits, and despite McConnell's very generous and wonderful and much appreciated support, we do work on a shoestring, and we're not in a position like the conference board where we can hire economists left, right, and center and expensive consultants and so on. So we'd be delighted to work with students and professors to help turn around the kind of research that we need, that we don't have time to do in our daily lives, and that's one reason why CFICE is such a valuable initiative to us. So I'd like you to sign up for our newsletter list outside. I'd like you to consider becoming a member of Food Secure Canada. If you're a student and not an income earner, as they say, you can do it for $10, otherwise it's $30. I'd also like to invite you to participate in the interactive webinar that we're going to hold with the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food right after he delivers his final report on Canada to the United Nations, and to participate in that conversation with us. And there too, I must thank Carleton for its very, very generous support, passing its big blue button technology into this international dialogue. It's really making it possible not only for academics, but for people who use food banks, who work in community centers, who are living with food insecurity, to participate in a dialogue with people who are discussing this in Geneva at the Palais des Nations in circumstances that they are not at all familiar with. So I do hope you'll get involved, and I thank you very much for listening to my comments.
Thank you very much, Diana. I know that it is 11, and so if you do have to leave, please do so. But I think for some of the rest of us, it would be a pleasure to continue the conversation. So if we could again get underway, any questions or comments for Diana? Please.
Thanks so much, Diana. My name is Nick Falvo. I'm a fellow member of the Alternative Federal Budget Working Group, so great to have you here. We are on a university campus, and Carleton, like a lot of universities, has an exclusivity contract with a big food and beverage company called Aramark. And the way these contracts work is, you have to order food from that company. If this event had wanted to order, coffee or beverages from some small co-op, they would have either had to have snuck it by the Aramark folks or asked for special permission. And I'm just wondering, on a campus with young people who've left home for the first time, are cooking for themselves, are learning to live independently, what do these exclusivity contracts that university campuses have with these companies do for food security?
Well, I have a feeling Cathleen may also have things to say about that. I would put you in touch with an organization called Meal Exchange, which does work on campus food security issues, and I think has some interesting work to do. Also, I mentioned the certification organization, Local Food Plus, and they have actually managed to change some university, I think it's University of Toronto, they've actually managed to change the bad old contracts and replace them with new contracts that are both economically, social, and environmentally sustainable. So my view is, if it's a bad contract, break it. And I can't help but think of, when I was in university, it was apartheid, and we had to force the banks who were on campus to disinvest from South Africa. And I think it's very important to use those kind of pressure tactics. And if they're not going to change the kind of food they serve, then somebody else should be serving the food. And frankly, I find the awareness of food amongst younger people just so much greater than the awareness amongst my generation. So it's time to change these things right in our communities, I think. But Meal Exchange and Local Food Plus would be two good places to start. They're both McConnell grantees, by the way.
Thank you.
Yes, they are. And Sierra Youth Coalition is another part of that group. Yep. Another question over here.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth McAllister, and I'm a consultant. Right now, one of my key clients is the Food and Agriculture Organization. I work largely on the strategy and management side. I'm not an agronomist. But I would like to sort of pose what might perhaps be a provocative question. And that's based on the fact that right now, globally, there are 178 million chronically malnourished people. Mm-hmm. There are 55 million children that are wasted. And 870 million people suffer from chronic hunger. And I'm looking at some of the investment in agriculture right now, and I just finished another piece with FAO and doing an evaluation on the FAO support to investment. And we came across a number of programs that are just starting now. It's sort of all connected with Obama and his key issue being food security. And what's been going on at the G8 and G20 in terms of food programming. And under the World Economic Forum, there's a new initiative for agriculture. And interestingly, the companies have set a goal of 20% reduction in water use over every decade until 2050. 20% increase in small farmer production, which is not subsistence poor, I recognize that, but nonetheless, small farmer production, particularly women, and 20% increase in food, access to food, based on the fact that FAO, depending on what department you talk to, predict that by 2050, we'll have to increase the world's food supply, access to the world's food supply, by 50% to 70%. So in looking at what the companies are trying to do and the corporations, particularly Unilever, which seems to be a leader now in more value-based corporate activity, I'm wondering if you are working or thinking of working with the corporate sector to try to bring them on board and to work with those that are trying to shift values within their organization, like Mars, and what your thoughts are, if any, on the WF program. Thanks.
Thank you.
All based on the fact that perhaps we can't do it without them. Thanks.
Right. So, who would like to start responding to that? Diana? Kathleen?
Well, there's a lot there. So, I mean, of course, we have, we must work with corporations because corporations are delivering the food. It's a little bit like saying, oh, well, we're not going to work with the market. Well, I mean, that's nice. But it's not going to work over the longer term. But it seems to me that the size, the reduced number and the increased size, the incredibly reduced number of corporate actors over all components of our food system, from seeds to fertilizers to pesticides to land ownership to retail, and I miss some. Yeah, like the whole processing industry. Kathleen's much better at this part than I am. We have an incredible problem of corporate concentration in the food system, and this globally. And there's an excellent report put out by the Etc. group called Who Owns the Green Economy that really breaks this down internationally for each sector of the food system. So I have no illusions that you know, I can go and sit down with the CEO of those companies and say, well, civil society would like to talk to you. In fact, we've tried to do that, and we've not been invited to the table. And I think one of the most dangerous things going on right now in food policy is that corporations are pretending to speak for all of us. And this is very, very obvious right now under the Conference Board's process. It's a process led by investors, where Loblaws and Nestle and Pepsi and Maple Leaf and McCain's and all of them sit at the table and are coming up with what they're calling a national food strategy. So they're calling this a national food strategy, and there are some non-corporate voices, very few at the table, and they had to be wealthy because you have to pay a lot of money to sit at the table. They're not participants, they're investors. And they are parading across the country like this is some neutral, for the benefit of us all initiative. And their number one goal is industry prosperity. You can go look at their papers, and the number one goal is industry prosperity. It's not sustainability. It's not hunger. It's not health. And it's not safety. It's none of those things, although they will dress up industry prosperity and all of those things. And as long as there's no new regulations and all we have is voluntary standards on sodium and so on, then it will all be fine. So I think what we need to do is develop a counterpower to that in order to be able to engage in a proper conversation about that. And that normally is the role of government, right? To mediate those things, to ensure that private interest does not run out, or does not win out over public interest. But that's clearly not happening in the current situation. And I mean, with regard to the hunger statistics that you mentioned, it's unbelievable that we're still at 800 million people who are hungry in this world, and that's a conservative estimate, as I'm sure you know. But for the first time, the number of people who are obese in this world has outstripped the number of people who are hungry. This is the other pole. This is the nonsensical system, food system, in which we are living. So I don't have any solutions to that. I guess it does get back to, I do see it as the role of government to bring all those actors around the table and not to just do the bidding of one sector of those actors and criticize everybody on the other side.
Can I respond to the previous question?
Sure, and then we'll let, yeah, go ahead.
I'd just like to respond really quickly. Of course, Diana, one of the reasons for obesity is that we depend on manufactured items which are designed to resemble food. But with reference to the FAO, the FAO Committee on World Food Security has recently, 2 years ago now, developed a civil society mechanism to get some representation, give some voice to peasants, fisherfolk, indigenous people, nomads, and so on. And so there is some move at a policy level as well, which people should be aware of. And even though North America is not actually formally considered a region, we are participating in that process. The other thing I wanted to comment really quickly is that we're looking, unfortunately, at the architects of the Green Revolution, which industrialized the food system globally, dependent on high technology, genetic engineered seeds and so on. For the solutions, we have to have a different discourse than that. So yes, of course, work with those people through things like the civil society mechanism, but be aware that we require a vision which is a sustainable one, not one which is predicated on different issues.
Okay, please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Christopher Yordi, and I'm a PhD student in the School of Public Policy here at Carleton, also a researcher with the CFICE project. And in a little bit of data gathering that I did prior to this event, I found that in 3 provinces in Canada, the most populous provinces, food security, as per the Health Canada website, food insecurity had gone up from about 8% to 12% in some provinces. Mm-hmm. And that was from 2007 to 2009. We're missing data, missing evidence perhaps for the more recent years yet, but that I think is characteristic of some of the extent of food insecurity in Canada and how it's growing. My question is, how do we characterize the vulnerability of Canadians? One of the groups that we've seen is most vulnerable is in the Canadian North, but what are some of the other dimensions of food insecurity in Canada? Is it linked directly to poverty? What are some of the factors that shape that? Are they the same people?
Well, there's certainly, Peter made mention of Valerie Tarasuk at the University of Toronto, who's one of the preeminent researchers in this field, and she certainly has dedicated many years to the proposition that the basic factor is inadequate income. And the fact is that as long as we're dependent on purchasing food, that is going to be the predominant issue. Behind that is the system which provides inadequate, non-nourishing foods for lower prices than highly nourishing, nutrient-dense foods. So that's the other. That's a quick answer.
I do remember out of Val Tarasic's work that, and this may surprise people, that the working poor are a larger part of that population than people on income assistance. So it's issues of minimum wage really become crucial here. Right. Single moms and single parent families are there. Children are disproportionately part of the those who aren't getting enough food in Canada. So it's those vulnerable groups. Yeah.
In rural Nova Scotia, we used to say everybody's a bust radiator away from the food bank.
I would just add Aboriginal people is extraordinarily high, and people with health or mental health issues also very high, and that links to the income support level.
Disabilities of any sort.
Disability of any sort, yeah.
Next question.
Hi there. Thank you all very much for your presentations. It was great. My name is Jamie Hurst. I work for Ottawa Public Health. And I was just wondering specifically what sort of actions, policies, programs you see the local municipalities, local governments playing in addressing the issue of food insecurity.
There's work for all levels of government and all sectors, and in Ottawa Public Health it's interesting because one of the activities that's really spawned a lot of exciting activity at the municipal level across country is the establishment of municipal food policy councils, and Ottawa is just in the process of about to start a municipal food policy council, the Ottawa Food Policy Council, and those become a forum for the various sectors within the region to work together to address issues. And there's you know, you have issues around community gardening. You have I'm trying to remember the list. Kathleen and I are both on the steering committee that was part of a research project out of University of Ottawa that's leading to the establishment of the Ottawa Food Policy Council. And there's a lot of activities that can happen at that municipal level to deal with these issues. Ultimately, though, it's important to remember that given that these are income-related issues, I mean, municipalities have a role there, but it's higher levels of government that need to make sure the municipalities have the resources at that level. Did you want to say anything? You're looking at me, Diana, as if you're about to.
Well, I thought Kathleen was going to speak, but I just noticed that Vancouver Food Policy Council just adopted a strategy last week, so I think that's probably worth looking at. I'm sure you got lots of things to say, Kathleen, Just Food and everything you guys are doing.
Well, yeah, I think the interesting part about the new Food Policy Council is the breadth of participation from public health. I mean, Just Food is coordinating it, but the participation is from every sector, and I think that's what's going to make it possible to come up with creative, different solutions. I mean, there's a sense in which, at this point, we're on this side of the mountain heading up. And until we get to the top, we're not going to be able to see what some of the solutions might be. But if everybody is talking together, then we stand a pretty good chance.
Okay.
Hi there, everyone. Thanks for coming out. It was a delightful conversation with all of you. My name is Chris Bisson. I'm an MA candidate here in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. I recently had the privilege to be up in Mary's Harbour, Labrador as an esteemed judge on a crab festival. Barring their excessive use of Miracle Whip was amazing. But this speaks to, like, this crab festival was organized by the Newfoundland Fishermen's Union. And they recently implemented a new processing plant in Mary's Harbour. And an unfortunate thing going on throughout all of Labrador, South Coast certainly, is that a lot of communities are dying out because they can't support a fishery. But of course, Mary's Harbour managed to scrape by from the Fisheries Union. This a brief comment and a question, I suppose, mostly directed at Terry, but I want all of your input is, first of all, the comment, I think, speaking to the importance of cooperatives and labor-owned organizations going forward and democratizing this process, because, I mean, we talk about democratization of this system, but I really, at the heart, I don't think we're democratizing unless we democratize the means of production. But my question is, despite the valiant effort of this fishery to eke out an existence and maintain their outport livelihood, there's still pressure from, for instance, the province that is talking about bringing processing to the island. We forgive you, Kathleen, as Labradorians. that's just a jab at Newfies, I'm sorry. But also even bringing it abroad over to Asia for processing. And I'm wondering, Terry, I mean, I know Nunatsiavut has a very successful fishery up in Kneen, and what have they done, if you know, to try and deal with the pressures to export the processing?
For the fisheries, not only in Nunatsiavut but in Nunavut as well, it's emerging, and they have been trying to adopt existing and past experiences based on the larger fisheries that has happened in Newfoundland as well as on the West Coast. And then there was question as to whether or not the fisheries need to be relooked at and whether a moratorium should be put in place based on the very little knowledge that's available on the current stocks and what's happening. But my suggestion was that that further research is needed just to ensure that there isn't any preconceived policies put in place, such as putting on a moratorium. But with respect to the localized economies in Nunatsiavut, it's all based on the local people who have knowledge of the area and that are trying to develop something that is based on what's been done out there. And this is, again, in the general context of things, when large agriculture and large corporations start dictating what diet or what food is going to be produced, it puts in the dangers as to what I can feed my family from the local bounty. And again, it's the general question as to how we can best develop that based on everyone's local input into how they're going to harvest or hunt or farm. So it's a matter of keeping in place the local expertise and ensuring that it's developed in such a way that it's sustainable. I think that kind of answers your question. Yeah. The importance of diversity is important. And I've always suggested that what Inuit eat shouldn't necessarily be judged. Locally, the Green Party had almost adopted getting rid of their stance on sealing, because the movement was that sealing was green, the stock was free range, and that it was just very sustainable. And this is what we argue in the Inuit culture, is that what we do is green, what we do is free range, and it's within localized stocks. So.
Okay, thank you. One more question, I think, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Leslie McKinnon. I work with the Carleton Center for Community Innovation, which hosts the CFICE Secretariat. So I've been involved in kind of setting up this event a little bit and getting some of this set up for everybody to come today, and thank you for coming. Some of the discussions about fragility and resilience were kind of striking for me. Some of my family friends down in the Brockville area just suffered a massive fire at their small local family-run dairy farm, and not only did they lose all 130 of their cattle and their building and what had been produced of their dairy, but they also lost 50 years of breeding stock knowledge and development and all of this work that had gone into producing such a strong and healthy source of locally produced dairy. So this notion of fragility is kind of striking for me at this moment. What also struck me, this is a family-run business, but the two sons that are my age, in their early 20s, were kind of managing this business. One of them just had a child in September, so it's kind of a crisis situation. And what role, I guess, does the government play in ensuring resiliency in the face of crisis when we do have a small farmer or a small producer that basically loses everything in a single night? What role does the federal government play in ensuring resiliency? is my question.
Well, I'll tell you what they don't do. They don't decide that there's an epidemic of avian flu and kill every last chicken in the Lower Fraser Valley of British Columbia with all the bloodlines. They don't do that. You don't do, you look at a situation and say, where is what is the structural need here, and deal with it directly.
Actually, I'm going to, I think, just to this question, just Brewster, briefly. All right.
I was just thinking, maybe you all noticed in this morning's paper news of the fire at St. Albert, or the co-op, the cheese co-op. And I was remembering that about 20 years ago, when the Toronto Food Policy Council was getting off the ground, the province of Ontario decided that squeaky curds were not acceptable. They were a health risk. And the squeaky curds could no longer be marketed by St. Albert. They would have to be refrigerated. Well, there was, I mean, it was a really, just remembering the appropriateness of the story, because all the people who used to drive from here out to St. Albert to get their squeaky curds were outraged. And we had a very interesting then exchange with the provincial government, and I think it was NDP at the time, actually, and they were able to be impressed that in fact, squeaky curds were really good. And they could not sort of outlaw them on the grounds that they had to be refrigerated. So I don't know what we do now for St. Albert cheese, because their cheddar is really good, and they've got the curds. But I just say this was people power from the bottom up that reversed what appeared to be just a clinical decision about what was healthy and what wasn't. It was wonderful.
Great. Thank you very much. Good note to close on. I think probably the panelists will be able to stick around for a little bit longer if you have a particular question, if you want to continue the conversation. But we should bring our proceedings to a close now. And I just want to say very quickly that I want to appreciate each of the panelists' contribution. Peter has outlined for us a whole new horizon around knowledge transfer and collaboration between the research community and the food security movement in Canada. Thank you for that. Terry, you brought a very compelling message from Canada's North, one I think that we're all going to carry with us when we leave here today. These are urgent issues for this country, and I really do commend you in your work and look forward to a future conversation with the McConnell Foundation. But never mind. Cathleen, as always, thank you so much. I have to admit, I'm going to walk away with the image of a breast and its role in the food system. Thank you very much for that, and for your ongoing work in championing this movement. Diana, you laid out a very clear set of policy recommendations to this government that are practical, feasible, and I think would be taken up by voters right across this country. So thank you so much. To our panelists, thank you. Thank you to Carleton University and to CFICE for convening this conversation. I know it'll be the beginning of many more, and thank you so much for all of you for taking the time out of your busy lives to be here today. Thanks on behalf of the panel, CFICE, and again, the McConnell Foundation is very active and involved in this movement and supporting food innovation. I do appreciate the comment from a questioner here from FAO. We too believe that it's time to bring the corporate sector into into a constructive relationship with this movement and with government to move this forward. So thanks very much. Great.
Okay, my turn. I'll be really, really quick because he took all of my speech. What can I tell you? So first of all, we would like to invite you to continue the conversation with us on this issue, on the issues of poverty reduction, community environmental sustainability, and violence against women. Thatcommunityfirst.org. We do have a forum, we have a blog, and we invite you to join us and continue the conversation. And so yes, thank you. We have a thank you to all of the people who were involved in the organization of the event. Food Secure Canada, our partner, the co-lead, who very much led the development of this event, and we really appreciate that. Thank you to Ted Jackson, who stepped in for a sabbatical Peter Andree to work with the Hub co-lead and to create this event, a starting event. There will be more. There will be different venues, different formats, but there will be more. And we hope that you will join with us on our journey. And so we do have a thank you to our panelists who have demonstrated very ably that campus, community, together, learning can make a difference. Thank you. And we have a parting gift. And Terry, I'm sorry, I didn't know that we had an alternate, but we would like each of the panelists to have this as a memory for the event. So thank you very much. Oh. And Tim? Oh. Get yours as well. So thank you for your able chairmanship.